Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and welcome to week 3 of our study of early American history. Last week, we looked at the beginnings and the startup of different colonies, especially the English colonies, which were ones we are most connected with and the ones we're most interested in learning because that's our heritage. We talked about, I think, a little bit about the major groups that came to the New World and their motivations. First of all, there was the Spanish. They were the first. They were interested in gold and silver, and they did pump millions and millions of pounds of gold and silver out of South America. Of course, they converted the Indians or the nationals at the end of the sword, made them Catholic Christians, baptized them, and then worked them to death. That was their pattern. As I told you about the book Rivers of Gold, which I do highly recommend, they go on to talk about what happens when they run out of natives. They literally work them all to death. Queen Isabella tells them to go to the Bahamas and get natives there. They had already expended so many of them, there were not enough there. And so they went to Africa, where they started bringing natives from Africa to work. And this is how slavery came to the New World, basically at the hands of the Spanish. There was so much gold and so much silver in Central and South America that they set up a mint and began to mint the coins here instead of doing it there. And of course, we're still finding there's one found this week of a Spanish galleon full of silver and gold doubloons that were still intact, and they had found 300 or 400 pieces of it. So it's still very much current in our world today. The French, looking for a path around what they discovered, the land they discovered, went down to the St. Lawrence River as far as they could go, discovered the Great Lakes, and got into the fur trapping business. Because of that, they become the fashionistas, if you will, of Europe. And of course, people like John Jacob Astor will make a fortune out of furs and fur coats and fur hats. And there's going to be a wave of beaver hats in England. It was all the rave, or Europe in general. It was all the rave to own a beaver hat, and so that became a major stocking item in the old world, is these beaver hats from America, and so that drove the fur trapping trade and all the different things. Interestingly enough, when we get on into when you get to take the second half of this course, you'll talk about a theory by a man named Frederick Jackson Turner, where he says the West became the definer of what Americans were and would be. And so one of those frontiers that he talks about is the fur trapping frontier. You think about what that would mean in that day. You're not talking about a Walmart on every corner, or you're not talking about a CVS or a Walgreens or any place to buy anything, except maybe at these settlements. If they had a general store, you could find supplies and things that you had to have if you went out trapping. Most trappers went out 6 months, came in 6 months and sold their furs and went back out again. So they were constantly away from civilization. The British are going to have a problem with that because they worry about, of course, British sensibilities of being civilized. And you've got to understand that this is going to become one of the things that Great Britain is all about as an excuse for their colonialism of taking over places and taking over people. They called it the white man's burden. They believed that it was their place to civilize human beings, these uncivilized people that had all this land in America. It was their job. It's interesting in places like India, where there was so much religion there with Hinduism and 10,000 gods and Islam. They created a situation in which one of the Indian nationals killed his commanding officer, and he was actually a Hindu, and the British portrayed it as a Muslim killing a Christian officer. And so they used that as their impetus and their reason to drive all the Muslims into the north of India, which would eventually become the country of Pakistan. And then Pakistan in 49 will have a civil war and divide between Pakistan and what's now Bangladesh. Bangladesh is now one of the most forward-looking and forward-leaning countries in Islamic countries in the world. That hit Bangladesh and Turkey are probably both the two most. But at any rate, they brought over in India the commanders of their army, the British Army, were compelled to bring their wives over to teach Indian women how to make tea at 4 o'clock and do that the proper way. Those are the things that the Brits were very concerned about, is preserving their culture. And so they wanted to impose that on other people. And that's what I tried to do with the American Indians, of course, and ended up wiping them out. And of course, we helped them with that. So these things are very much alive and very much need to be understood, that these Europeans, the reason they took the Indian land was that, of course, the Pope passed a papal bull that says no savages, quote unquote, had any right to own God's land. God had that for Christians, and it was free to take and free to wipe them out, much like they did in the Old Testament. When the Jews went into the promised land, they were told to wipe out all the people, babies, women, children, everything. That scripture kind of echoed in my mind recently when I was thinking about what was going on in Gaza with the Palestinians, wiping out everybody that's not considered a part of the Israeli group. And so that was exactly what they did. And of course, Brits practiced that. Americans have practiced that wherever we have been involved with colonial kind of structures. So Spanish, the French, the Dutch. The Dutch are probably the most concerned ethically with. They actually purchase their land from the Indians, and you know the story probably of the island in New York City where they paid like $12.43 for Manhattan. But they did try to at least make the effort to pay some price for it. And so, but the Dutch weren't very long in the New World. They very soon sold out their New York holdings to the British, and New York became a British city. But all of these things began to introduce the thing you're going to talk about this week, and that is material culture into this new world that's very different from what was here. The Indians had what they could make out of bone and stone and anything else, but they lacked in tools that they would have had in England, because of they already had metal tools that were being used, and so they were much further along in the evolutionary scale of items. And so these things become very precious to the Native Americans, and it becomes this catching point because they wanted copper pots, they wanted metal pots. They could do so much more with cooking and different things if they had these kind of implements than they could with what they were using, because they did not, very difficult to shape a cooking utensil out of stone, or depending on where you live, some stone might be better. Of course, they did clay pots and clay things of that nature to carry water, but most of that was not possible to cook in. So basically these things, then guns, of course, and gunpowder become a huge help to the natives of killing food to eat. So these things they did want. And so it's very difficult for them to turn loose of these material goods and just deny the colonists and attack them, wipe them out. And they could have at the beginning point, but they were so enamored with the things they brought, the baubles and the shiny things that they brought with them to trade. So that is the catching point that you'll talk about this week. And of course, we talk about the Columbian Exchange, where these things are transferred around the world, and you have European goods coming to America, and you have American stuff, food stuff mainly, going and furs going back to Europe, and that make a difference in Europe. I mean, potatoes and tomatoes literally change. Tomatoes change Italy. Potatoes will keep the Germans from starving to death, and the Irish, of course. And then when the potato famine happens in the 1800s, many of them will move to America, but it does keep them alive. So these things are very much a part of the material culture. Part of your project this week will be to go into a museum online, wherever, and find these artifacts that are there, and to think and write about them, how they were used, and that these were, I think it's important for us as historians to understand and to learn about the things that we find, that they are part of the workforce or the living of these people. When I was born, we had a farm which encompassed what was known as the Kiwi Township, which was the lowest town of the Cherokee in just upstate South Carolina. And so they built a power hydroelectric dam there to make electricity in 1965. And before that, it was easy for us to walk out through our garden where we're plowing up the earth and getting ready to grow food, to find arrowheads and to find hatchet handles and hatchet heads, all these things of metal that had lain there for several hundred years. Maybe it'd been a battlefield, and you found all kind of hatchets and things of that nature. And so those were material things of the culture of the Native Americans, and you could take those back and you could learn based upon what they were composed of, how that culture lived at the particular time that you're looking at it. Interestingly enough, in archaeology, which I dearly love and enjoy, the place you find the best artifacts of material culture, I bet you can't guess where. It would be in the garbage dump. I worked 11 times in Israel, and we always would go through the garbage of a city first that we were about to excavate, Jericho, Jerusalem, whatever. I had the privilege, by the way, of meeting Kathleen Kenyon, who was the famous lady architect, probably the most famous lady architect of that area, who literally excavated Jericho in the Bible, the biblical Jericho, which is really, really interesting. Our group was riding in the desert one day, and our tour guide said, "Oh, you're about to get a blessing." And so this bus is meeting us, and it reminded you of people riding camels in previous days in that desert. And no doubt when they met up with each other, they got off their camel and sat in the shade and had a cup of coffee or something to drink and discuss whatever it was. Well, this is kind of like that, two buses in the middle of the desert. And the guy on the other bus was an archaeologist by the name of Dr. Vendel Jones. Dr. Jones was also a Baptist preacher, and he would spend his off season, and there is an off season and on season when you're able to work in these places because of the weather, in the States, going to churches and preaching about what he was finding. But what was interesting was he was actually the person that the Indiana Jones series was modeled after. That was his life. It's a life of adventure and a life of exploration and looking for the Ark of the Covenant. All the things that become the storyline for Indiana Jones was Vendel Jones's lifeline. So I've had some really unique experiences when it comes to looking at material culture and understanding the value of it. You realize that someday you ask yourself the question, what are people going to find when they go through my garbage and what's left behind? I'm afraid we're not leaving behind very much that's going to last 100 years. Paper, plastic, cardboard, all this stuff is not worth anything. But someday, 100 years from today, somebody's going to be going through the things that you have there where you're living. My book's behind me. Somebody will take those books, hopefully, and we'll learn and grow from them and that kind of stuff. So that's what we're talking about this week. So as you look at this material, think about that when you're working on that. I think it will be a blessing to you to realize that you're holding in your hand, or you're looking at something that is several hundred years old. Your grandmother, if she's living, or your mother, might have artifacts from your family past that it would be worth asking the question, where did this cabinet come from? You might be surprised. It might be that your ancestors brought that west on a wagon, horse and wagon. There's still a lot of those things around. I love to watch the home show, Antiques Home Show, Road Show. Watch that because of the things that are on there. So they have Native American blankets that are 200 years old and things. Those are the material culture of those people. And so you learn so much from them. And I hope you will this week learn a great deal. If you have any questions or comments about this video or about anything else, please put it in the discussion box for that at the top. I'd be more than happy to engage you in conversation and to deepen your experience in this class and the things that you're learning. But I just wanted to share that with you today. Thank you so much.